Hello, dear students. My name is Smenitska Olesya Mikhailовna. I lecture discipline by philosophy. The theme of now lecture, the emergence of a culture of thinking, the subject and method of philosophy. Let's see our plan. In our lecture, we can use worldview concept, type and form worldview, type of worldview, philosophy subject, method, philosophy methods.
Before we get to that, a bit of a history about philosophy. So, once upon a time, philosophy was anything you can study. Everything in the realm of study was a type of philosophy. But as time went on, different disciplines developed, and they started taking chunks out of philosophy. Things that were originally considered philosophy were turned into other disciplines, and those disciplines emerged and took on their own life and way of doing things until we only had so much left that was philosophy that couldn't be categorized into other disciplines. But philosophy still had its fingers in all of those other pies. You still had philosophy of science, philosophy of religion, philosophy of education, philosophy of mind. All of those things still existed in philosophy and served not merely as kind of an old version of what those people did, but rather a way to connect that discipline to other disciplines. Philosophy is that in-between substance, that thing that can actually connect both science and religion, that can put different disciplines on the same playing field to talk to each other. And all of these disciplines to this day still honor their original connection to philosophy, because everyone, when they get the highest degree in any of these disciplines, gets a PhD or a doctorate in philosophy of whatever they're talking about. Therefore, I give you philosophy, the glue that holds all of the rest of academia together. Now, at the center of philosophy, you have logic and philosophical methods. These are the methods with which philosophy can connect these various disciplines, as well as kind of translate our normal language in something that can be evaluated and assessed by math and the simple rules of logic. So we'll start in this with formal classical logic, but we also have non-classical logic we'll look at, informal logic, and philosophical methods. So let's take a look first at formal classical logic. So the basic building blocks of formal classical logic are first order logic. This starts off with propositional logic, which is kind of macro logic dealing with the relations between propositions and statements and the logic in between those, as well as categorical logic, which is kind of an older version of logic that works on the micro scale that deals with subjects and predicates within each of those propositions and statements. Those two combined in the more modern era to form predicate calculus that quantifies over those individual subjects and predicates, but also works on the larger scale relating propositions to each other. When you take this a step further, you get to higher order logic. Higher order logic doesn't just quantify over objects. We don't just say for all apples. It quantifies over predicates as well. It can say for all types of thing that a certain thing is predicated of, for all sets that have three members. Included in this are things like type theory from Bertrand Russell. You have set theory, which advanced from that, which is dealing with sets of particular objects and rules about them, as well as arguably the philosophy of math, though philosophy of math could be just as easily put in metaphysics as a category, because it deals both with kind of the connection between math and logic, as well as questions about what the reality of particular mathematical objects is. Moving further outside of kind of the basics of classical logic, you have modal logics. These, we've done many series on modal logics, but they start with the idea of alethic modal logic, which is the most basic kind of modal logic. This is the logic of possibility and necessity. When you say something is necessary or something is possible, what do you mean? You'll note it's quite close to modality, the study of possible worlds, But modal logic can also map onto other things as a framework for understanding different ways that we speak. So you also have temporal logic, which is where we deal with the logic of time, the past, the present, the future, something that will always be or has always been. Also within the category of modal logics, you have epistemic logic. Epistemic logic is the logic of knowledge, belief, justification, how you can make logical arguments using those tools. And we also have deontic logic. Deontic logic is the logic of ethics and obligation, particularly when you're in a particular form of ethical theory, which we'll get to in a bit. Now we're going to move on to non-classical logic. So non-classical logics generally deny or question kind of one of the basic premises of classical logic. So we have many valued logics. This is more than just true and false. A very popular version of this is known as fuzzy logic, that there are lines of in between something being true and false. You also have computability logic. This deals with not what is true in terms of logic, but what we can prove and provability. You also have linear logic. Linear logic works with kind of a combination of intuitionistic logic, which we'll get to in a sec, and classical logic. You have non-reflexive logic, which in certain ways denies the law of identity and saying that identity isn't necessarily reflexive. You have relevance logic as well. Relevance logic talks about concerns dealing with kind of the conditional in logic, if-then statements, talking about do if-then statements, does the antecedent and the conditional need to be related? In classical logic, they don't need to be. Relevance logic puts a requirement on them that they do need to be related. Intuitionistic logic. Intuitionistic logic denies the law of the excluded middle and questions that. And there are many, many more non-classical logics. You have pair-consistent logic, non-monotonic logic, and many more. But the basic idea in this section of logic is these are logics that question some basic tenet of kind of our formal classical logic. Now we're going to move on to informal logic. So when I'm talking about informal logic here, informal logic isn't particularly well defined. We're going to talk really about non-deductive kinds of logic. Deductive logic is what we've been looking at so far, where the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. In inductive arguments, for example, inductive arguments claim that the truth of the premises makes the conclusion more likely. So inductive arguments look at taking a lot of specific cases and generalizing from them. Every time I have dropped this rock, it has gone towards the ground. Therefore, every time I will drop the rock, it will go towards the ground. I've taken specific cases and I've generalized for them. This is what's done a lot in science. Abductive arguments, on the other hand, are arguments towards the best explanation. Based on all of the pieces of information we have so far, the best explanation for this is something. A famous abductive argument, of course, is the watch argument for the existence of God. Basically, the idea that if you're walking out in the world and you discover a watch, the best explanation for that watch is that it had a designer of some kind. Note, though, that abductive arguments, like inductive arguments, are not deductively valid. The truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Now we're going to talk a bit about philosophical methods. So all of these arguments are working with premises that we've come up with in some way and seeing what we can get from those premises, what we can conclude from them using various systems of logic. Philosophical methods looks more at how we get those premises to begin with, specifically using a couple different techniques of philosophy. So one technique that's used by many philosophers is thought experiments. Thought experiments start with a philosopher saying, imagine that this is the case. And it tries to lead your intuition, which we'll touch on in a sec, to a particular conclusion. It gives you the intuition with that. And based on that intuition, a philosopher will conclude something else using that intuition and logic. Experimental philosophy studies these particular intuitions. It looks into what the most common intuitions are, whether or not certain intuitions are justified either through the sources that we use to create them, through their popularity, and so on. Experimental philosophy, interestingly, is one of the more recent fields in philosophy, and it actually uses empirical research as opposed to everything else, which is more armchair philosophy, which just uses someone thinking in a chair. Intuitions are those things that we're talking about. They're your feeling or your impression, your seeming, what, when presented with a particular situation, you would generally assent to or agree with, as opposed to what you wouldn't agree with. And those intuitions are kind of what we use as the basic building blocks to build some of the premises and arguments that we build in philosophy. So that's logic and philosophical methods. That forms kind of the heart of philosophy. That is the thing, if nothing else, which holds together all the varied and disparate disciplines of philosophy. These are not everything in logic, but this is a lot of the big players when you're talking about logic. Also, note, in this video, we're talking a lot about analytic philosophy. When you go to things like continental philosophy and other things like that, they may have different ways of even talking about or understanding logic in terms that Hegel or someone like that might present. But with that in mind, we're going to move on to history and traditions of philosophy, where we'll briefly touch on both the history of philosophy, but also some different traditions of philosophy. So we'll start with the history of philosophy. Generally, you can divide philosophy up into a couple different eras or periods of time. A lot of times the ancient Greeks and Romans are kind of lumped together. This is where you have people like Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, but also many, many more. You have positions like Stoicism, Skepticism, Atomism, Cyrenaicism, Epicureanism, and so on, which arise during this period, but also many, many more. This is kind of considered the birthplace of philosophy, where at least the Western philosophical tradition starts. So of course, there are many other philosophical traditions as well. In kind of this Western tradition continuing to follow it, we next have medieval philosophy. This has a lot of the scholastics. The scholastics basically had the ancient Greek texts in the Bible, and they tried to make them make sense together. It has Thomism and patrology. If you go back farther in the kind of Christian tradition, you have such philosophers as St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Augustine, Boethius, and St. Anselm of Canterbury. Moving forward in time, as we start to come into the Renaissance, we have 17th century philosophy, also sometimes known as early modern philosophy. We have such philosophers as René Descartes, John Locke, Gottfried Leibniz. You have positions like rationalism, empiricism, idealism, dualism. In kind of more political philosophy, of thinkers like Thomas Hobbes that emerge. We start having kind of this renaissance of ideas, the recreation of ideas, and we start having some of these philosophical arguments that we haven't really had since the ancient Greeks again, and start advancing on them and coming up with new ideas. Moving into 18th century philosophy, the ideas here are really dominated by Kant, of course, and Hume. We're talking about a lot of the ideas that were brought up in the 17th century, but advancing them further, trying to maybe solve some of those problems or move on to new ideas. You, of course, also have people like Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire in this period that are presenting ideas. Hume and Kant are some of the most influential philosophers in all of the history of philosophy, and so this is a very important time for what would influence philosophy moving forward. In the 19th century, philosophy really blooms and expands even more. You have philosophers like John Stuart Mill, Hegel, William James, Friedrich Nietzsche. You have a bunch of new positions that are emerging, like German idealism, pragmatism, utilitarianism, and transcendentalism that appear during this time. And philosophy starts to expand just as more people get educated and are able to engage in that philosophical discussion. Moving forward, you now move on to 20th century philosophy, which of course blooms even more. You have the greats like Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein. You have Karl Popper, Martin Heidegger, Thomas Kuhn, David Lewis, Kurt Gödel, Quine, Sartre. The list could go on and on. But the more recent we get, the more difficult it gets to sum up smaller and smaller periods of time with a very quick look into that period in philosophy. We are in the process of making videos right now on a list of great philosophers, and we are going to look more into the history of philosophy. But for now, that's a very, very, very brief look into kind of some of the history of philosophy and how philosophy advanced over time. Now we're going to talk about some various traditions in philosophy. I will fully admit before we get into this that I am an analytic philosopher. I am based in analytic philosophy. So anything that I present in here that is incorrect, or someone that's better versed in one of these other traditions of philosophy, please correct me in the comments, but I'm going to do my best. So analytic philosophy generally is pervasive throughout the English-speaking world and has been for a while, and analytic philosophy is a tradition that's built out of the tradition we were kind of looking at that starts with the ancient Greeks and moves forward. But there are many other philosophical traditions that move forward. So in North America right now, we're mostly English-speaking philosophers, and so analytic philosophy is awfully dominant, but there are other traditions here, such as Native American philosophy. A lot of Native American philosophy has dealt with sovereignty, power, the idea of indigenous rights over certain lands, and has often been shaped by colonialism, since a lot of philosophy, or at least something that would be considered philosophy, came from people that came and colonized the Americas as well as other parts around the world. You have also Afro-Caribbean philosophy. This talks a lot about multiculturalism as well, of course, as colonialism and imperialism. Moving on to Latin American philosophy. Latin American philosophy often deals with issues like identity and specifically social issues in philosophy. There's also a good tradition of feminist philosophy within Latin American philosophy. Now, you have in Europe what might be considered one of the main traditions that kind of opposes analytic philosophy, which is known as continental philosophy. We're very, very briefly going to just list a couple of the positions that exist in continental philosophy and not in any way get into explaining what it is or if it even is its own separate thing. Continental philosophy includes things like phenomenology, post-structuralism, hermeneutics, existentialism, critical theory, speculative realism, German idealism, and more. I have a video on analytic versus continental philosophy that just barely touches the surface of this distinction. Hopefully we'll do more on continental philosophy because I know it's a very popular topic in the future. But for now, we're going to keep going. So African philosophy is a difficult topic. As you may be aware, I live in Africa, but Africa is a huge place, and to kind of explain all of Africa under one philosophy is very difficult. But also, Africa has not had, similar to kind of Native American philosophy and Latin American philosophy, been grossly impacted by its colonialist history. There's many philosophers that say that while the West was driven to philosophy through leisure time and just wanting to do it, Africans were forced to do philosophy to defend their own rights and defend their ideas. So there's a lack of a consistency within African philosophy. It's difficult as well because there's a very distinct difference between North African and Sub-Saharan culture, but also Sub-Saharan and North African development. You see a lot of philosophers in the ancient Greek and Roman period who are actually coming out of North Africa. You have all these interesting ideas that come out of North Africa. Carneades himself came from North Africa, came from Cyrene, which is in present-day Libya. And so that is in stark contrast with Sub-Saharan Africa, which had kind of not as quote-unquote Western philosophy. You had Eastern philosophy, which is certainly kind of a disjunctive kind in the sense that it's not a natural kind out there. Eastern philosophy doesn't encompass one tradition, but rather an accumulation of many different traditions that kind of are separate from Western philosophy. But unlike a lot of the philosophies that were in the developing world, Eastern philosophy existed long before a lot of the colonialist things or the expansion and the age of discovery, though I know that's not the best word for that. But moving on, we have Chinese philosophy, which deals with Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism is a part of that. Chinese philosophy and Confucius were very impactful throughout the region. You'll see many of these different philosophies have some element of Confucius or Confucianism in them, so that's very important. You have Japanese philosophy, which combines kind of Shinto original cultural beliefs with Buddhism as well as Confucianism, and even in more modern times developing how that combines with Western philosophy. You have even Korean philosophy, which similar to Japanese philosophy combines kind of Buddhism, but also a Neo-Confucianism, and sometimes includes shamanism. Separate from all of that, you have Indian philosophy, which very much exists as its own philosophy compared to a lot of other Eastern schools, which bring in different philosophies to that. There are really 10 major schools of Indian philosophy. There are 4 heterodox schools and 6 orthodox schools. I could do an entire series on Indian philosophy that would take up an entire year doing every single day. It's a complicated topic, but understand that it is very much its own philosophy. You also have Tibetan philosophy, just as Chinese philosophy in some ways gave rise to Confucianism. You have Tibetan philosophy, which is associated with Buddhism, which is as much a religion as a philosophy, and includes all of those elements of Buddhism, such as a formal debate system, as well as cultural practices. Something else that sometimes it's classified as Eastern philosophy, though technically it's somehow in between, is Islamic philosophy. It has a wide range of topics that are covered, more than a lot of these other kind of separate philosophies. It could pull from the West, because especially during the Middle Ages, the Arab world was the place where a lot of the ancient Greek texts were preserved. So there are many Islamic philosophers who, beyond just kind of relating things to the Quran, have separate opinions on things like metaphysics, post-colonial opinions, illuminationist schools, transcendent schools, things like that, that move to create Islamic philosophy as its own separate category. Once again, another thing that I could do an entire series on. Polynesian philosophy is another thing that kind of has a lot of that post-colonialist piece to it, though there was some kind of pre-colonialism metaphysics and cosmology that came along with it. And when we get down to Australia, once again, in the English-speaking world, analytic philosophy dominates a lot, though Australian realism has had its own kind of rise and its own identification as Australian philosophy having its own identity within the analytic philosophy world. Whew. So that was a lot of different places. Like I said, if you disagree with anything I said in that quick snapshot of philosophical traditions, please offer it in the comments below. I'm not an expert on a lot of these varying philosophies, but so please help me out. And that has covered history and traditions of philosophy, but we are far from done. So next we're going to take a look at value theory. Value theory is kind of the area of philosophy that may be most applicable towards daily life. We'll separate it into three areas. We'll start with aesthetics. So aesthetics is dealing with things like the philosophy of beauty, but also the philosophy of art, things that are pretty, things that are nice, things that are sublime or horrific. We'll look at the philosophy of art first. So the philosophy of art asks questions like, what is art? What can be classified as art? What is high art? What is popular art? But it also can be divided into specific philosophies of particular types of art. So you have things like the philosophy of literature, the philosophy of film, the philosophy of music, the philosophy of visual art, and any art that you can have a philosophy of that, looking into the specific interesting questions that are posed by that type of art. Because art looks so different across these media, it's difficult to have one set view on what is art that can encompass all of these different perspectives. You also have the philosophy of beauty. This deals with aesthetic judgment, aesthetic value, aesthetic cognition. So basically what we judge to be beautiful, what we value as something that is beautiful something beautiful valuable. Whether or not what we're thinking and what's going on in our brain when we're experiencing beauty. But it also deals with things like the sublime. Is sublime a different experience from beauty, and how can we categorize sublime? It deals with things like humor. What is funny to us? Is funny a type of beautiful? What makes something funny? Horror. Why do we enjoy things being horrific or frightening? And more. So that's kind of a brief snapshot into aesthetics. Next, we'll touch on social and political philosophy. So in terms of political philosophy, there are a lot of topics here, and it really has turned into its own field of political theory, but it has a deep, deep history in philosophy. This is dealing with questions of what is justice, especially as you go back to the ancient Greeks. The idea of what justice is was an important question. But also it asks questions about government. What are the best types of government for us to have? What are ways that we should choose government? How much power should a government have over its people? It deals with questions of freedom. This is things like free speech, the freedom of movement, but also people's general freedom in comparison to their government and in comparison to the people that are ruling them. Should we have anarchy? Should we have dictatorship? How can we negotiate somewhere in between? Political philosophy deals with many things. It goes through law, it goes political theory, war, international development, human rights, and much, much more. This is a huge area of philosophy, once again, but here's just a quick snapshot of some of the big issues. Social philosophy is another thing that kind of fits under this category because it works alongside political philosophy. Here are a couple of the big areas that people talk about. Feminism is a huge part of philosophy. It is a philosophy on its own. First, second, and third wave feminism have elements which exist in philosophy as much as they exist as a social movement. You have questions about equality, which are a huge part of social philosophy, asking on what things should we be equal and on what things should we not be equal. I think the story of Harrison Bergeron is a great kind of setup for some of these questions of Clearly, we shouldn't be equal on everything, but we should be equal on some things. The philosophy of culture, which deals with a lot of the things we were just talking about in traditions of philosophy, how philosophy and culture can intermingle, and also questions relating to culture, what culture is, how culture is created, what things are created by culture, and so on. But also we have things like the philosophy of gender, the philosophy of race, the philosophy of sex, the philosophy of sexuality, and more and more. Just as these things grow, so do the philosophies that are related to them. Just as any of the disciplines we looked at the beginning grow, so must the philosophies which can translate the ideas presented into those disciplines into a language that all of academia can speak grows. So that is, once again, a very brief snapshot into social and political philosophy. The last area of value theory is probably one of the most commonly associated with value theory, and it is one of the areas that frequently people are thinking about when they think about philosophy. It's moral theory and ethics. So this can kind of be divided into three parts. So we have ethics such as meta-ethics. Meta-ethics is asking the question, what type of thing is good? What type of thing is evil? Is something being good just an opinion that we have? Is it someone just saying, yay, this is good, I like it? Or is it actually something that exists completely separate from our subjective views about good? Is it something that exists naturally? Is it something that exists just based on our creation of it? And that's a big question in meta-ethics. In normative ethics, we kind of have an assumption that good is something we're going to be talking about, and we're asking, how can we divide things into good and bad? What's a general theory that we can use to divide particular acts or particular people into good and bad people? Three of the main theories in normative ethics are consequentialism, which has things like utilitarianism, that whatever is doing the most good is good. And you have rule utilitarianism versus act utilitarianism. Consequentialism generally focuses on the consequences of an action to determine if it's good or not. You have deontology, which looks at things like divine command theory, but also Kantian ethics. This is kind of making very specific rules. If you follow these rules, you will be good. Virtue ethics, which looks more at the virtue of a person, which talks about virtues and vices. This is going all the way back to Aristotle, though it's had a resurgence recently. Virtues being kind of the balance between two vices. If someone acts virtuously, they're doing good. If you act as a virtuous person would, then you're acting in a good way. And this has a lot of play in with what we saw earlier, deontic logic, the logic of ethics and obligation, especially when you're dealing with kind of rules or that kind of either rule utilitarianism or rules in terms of deontology or another theory of ethics, which can be then formulated into kind of logical sentences. Going a step further, kind of zooming in down on ethics, you have applied ethics. Applied ethics takes those normative theories and applies them to specific real problems that we have in the world. These are things like biomedical ethics, business ethics, environmental ethics, professional ethics, political ethics, social ethics, technology ethics, development ethics, and much, much more. Whenever you're actually asking about a real world problem, is this person's actions, are they good or bad? That's a question in applied ethics. And applied ethics, as much as any area of philosophy, has its fingers in any pie where you're dealing with really any kinds of questions of what should you do? What is good for you to do? So that's a brief glimpse into value theory, our third kind of general area of philosophy we're going to look into. And the last two areas kind of meld together, so we'll look at them simultaneously, and then we will look at the whole map. So first off, we'll talk a bit about epistemology. So epistemology is a big complex word which means the study of knowledge. Knowledge is generally considered by philosophers to be true justified belief, or true warranted belief, as you will. This is dealing with the principles of knowledge, the varieties of knowledge, and the definitions of knowledge. That's what we're studying when we're talking about epistemology. But this can expand to other things. So epistemic states and properties, when we're dealing with belief, we have to talk about the state of believing something or the state of being justified. We can also talk about the state of being wise, or the state of being epistemically lucky, just getting things right even though you might not have good reasons for it, being epistemically defeated, being rational, being warranted, or having something be based on something else. We also talk about social epistemology, where you have more than one person trying to know something, where you have trust, where you have interactions between people. Do you trust someone else's beliefs? And that's why you're justified in holding a particular belief or knowing a particular belief. You have collective mentality, you have social choice procedures, how we make choices as a whole based on our beliefs, and much more. You also have the sources of our epistemic knowledge. This comes down to one of the big distinctions in philosophy between a posteriori and a priori. A posteriori knowledge being knowledge that we get from the world with experience, and a priori knowledge being knowledge we get independent of experience. And this also digs down into specific types of experiences you can have. You can experience memory, testimony, reasoning, but also seeming, intuition, as we talked about before, and perception, as we will talk about in a moment. You also have tons of individual epistemic theories, such as skepticism or pragmatism, but also things like foundationalism, coherentism, contextualism, internalism, externalism, infinitism, reliabilism, rationalism, empiricism, and much, much more. In the future, I hope to do videos on all of these theories, but as you see, there's so much in philosophy to cover, it would take a lifetime to do it all. And you'll notice also we're right next to epistemic logic. Once again, building into our logical framework that connects all these areas of philosophy and even all the areas of academic discourse down to a logical framework that we can speak about these things such that people aren't talking past each other. So that's a brief glimpse into epistemology. You'll note there are some other things in this yellow color, but before we get to that, we're going to jump into our last area, which is metaphysics. So there are many, many different things in metaphysics, and it's a huge category. We're going to cover a number of them here, but there's always going to be more. So one of them is ontology. Ontology is the study of things that exist. It tries to divide the world into objects that exist and objects that don't exist. And different ontologies say that everything exists, nothing exists, or somewhere in between. Philosophy of objects talk about different types of objects. What are objects made of? What even are separate objects and things like that. You have Mariology, which breaks those objects down even further, talking about the part-hood relation. What do we mean when we're talking about parts of something? You have identity, once again, kind of relating to objects. Why is an object the same object over time if parts of it change? You have personhood, which both deals with issues of identity, what makes you the same person over time, but also with the idea of what makes something a person. At what point does someone become a person? And this connects back to issues in ethics, and specifically applied ethics when you're talking about issues of abortion. And you also have things like properties. So just as you have objects and things out in the world, those things seem to have properties like redness or roundness or sweetness. I'm thinking of an apple if you can't tell. But those properties, what are those things? Do they actually exist? How do they adhere to the objects? And answering the question of do they actually exist, you have specific metaphysical opinions like realism, such as universals or abstract objects really, really exist in the world. They're not just words we use to describe things. Realism would be an example of a global metaphysical theory, like relativism, process philosophy, physicalism, phenomenalism, monism, logical atomism, dualism, idealism, and more. These are global metaphysical theories that try to explain everything in metaphysics through kind of one lens. Those theories have to go across the various levels of metaphysics and connect. Once again, philosophy is about connection, connect between metaphysics and other elements of philosophy. So you have studies of interlevel metaphysics, like grounding, supervenience, reduction, grounding again, fundamentality, emergence, realization, determinants, determinables, and more. Interlevel metaphysics is talking about how we're playing and how physical or mental states can interact with each other. We also have, very simply, the metaphysics of time, talking about what time is. Can time exist without change? Is time real at all? You'll note, once again, connecting back to logic, time and temporal logic. You have modality, the study of possible worlds, not just the rules that govern what we can say about necessity and possibility, but rather what we're actually talking about. Are there real possible worlds out there that we're talking about when we say something is possible or necessary? You'll notice, once again, connected right next to alethic modal logic, which is the logic that kind of turns this and formalizes these philosophical theories into something that can connect to other disciplines. And of course, we have the study of causation, how cause and effect work. Is there even such a thing as causation? So that's a brief glimpse into theories that are specifically metaphysical. But there's a lot of realms of philosophy which are a part of metaphysics or a part of epistemology or have roots in both of those traditions. And that's what we're going to talk about right now. So two big areas of philosophy which are present in both of these areas and are things that I talk about a lot here on the channel are philosophy of religion as well as philosophy of science, which we will very briefly touch on right now. So philosophy of science has many different parts to it, but one of them is scientific methodology. And this kind of leans more on the epistemic side of how science is justified. Philosophy of science works to justify science. So one of the things we look at here is things like the problem of underdetermination. How, when we don't have enough information to determine which theory is true, can we pick a theory rationally? It deals with things like the new riddle of induction, talking about which predicates we use. This is probably more connected to philosophy of language and philosophy of science than anything else. Which predicates we use and how those particular predicates can be predictable over sets of things. And we also talk about the problem of induction, which connects back to inductive reasoning that we were talking about a moment ago, and inductive arguments, which are the basis for science. The problem of induction is talking about how we can ever have a scientific argument that's deductively valid, because that seems impossible given that we can't prove the uniformity of nature, that the future will always be like the past, without assuming that the future will always be like the past. The history of science is another important area of philosophy of science. This is not just cataloging the history of science, but rather talking about the way that our scientific theories shift and change over time, and how we're actually comparing our theories back to a paradigm that exists. And as that paradigm shifts, certain theories may become more or less justified. We're talking about natural kinds within the philosophy of science, especially as we get to our next thing, realism. Natural kinds are those things that exist in the world, and there's a question of, are scientists going out and discovering natural kinds, or were those natural kinds just kind of rules or turns of phrase that we've put in there ourselves? We're talking about realism. Scientific realism is an important position in the philosophy of science because that's one of the positions that justifies the truth of scientific theories, or claims to justify the truth of scientific theories, with a philosophical backing that can let those theories actually go head to head with theories of religion or theology or metaphysics or something else that tries to explain the way the world is. Because right now, without philosophy, science and religion talk past each other. If you build down to scientific realism, you can actually have that conversation using the same tools at the same plane field. This is different from realism in terms of metaphysics, where we're talking about that there actually are real universals or real abstracts, though they both go by the same name. There's a lot of things in philosophy that are called realism. In philosophy of science, we also have philosophy of every single scientific discipline you can possibly imagine. You have philosophy of biology, chemistry, physics, quantum mechanics, social sciences, cognitive sciences, computing, information, mathematics, psychology, medicine, anthropology, education, history, and more. The point here is, just like our philosophy of art, we had to separate it out into all of those different disciplines of art. Philosophy of science can be broken down into all of those different disciplines of science, because each of those disciplines has its own problems and its own issues. The ones we've covered here are those that kind of range across various areas of science, but there are particular problems that are unique to quantum mechanics, say, but might not exist in a bunch of other kinds of sciences that are out there. Now we're going to move on to another area of philosophy, which is philosophy of religion. Once again, with the idea of philosophy being kind of the connection between different disciplines, science and religion often talk past each other in arguments. So just as philosophy took science down to a level where it can communicate with other disciplines, it takes religion to a level where it can communicate with other disciplines. And one of the most important and central areas of philosophy of religion, which has been argued about since the beginning of time, is arguments for and against the existence of God or gods. Some of the most famous arguments for and against the existence of God include the ontological argument, which is an argument of proof of God's existence from pure reason alone, not using experience. You also have the teleological argument for the existence of God, which is kind of a best explanation. What is the best explanation of the things that we see in the world? As well as the cosmological argument for the existence of God, which asks, how could things have begun without a God, or how can we not have a prime mover without a God? It's kind of a regress ad God. It's a regress to either infinity or God. And with each of these arguments, of course, there's a set of objections to be paired with. And probably the most famous argument against the existence of God, which is the problem of evil. However, there are a number of other arguments against the existence of God, such as the Euthyphro dilemma. I could go on. Also in philosophy of religion, we study the attributes of God and just the ideas of, is it possible for something to be omniscient? And what does that mean for free will? Is it possible for something to be omnipotent? And what does that mean for logical rules? Is it possible for something to be omnibenevolent? And how does that pair with virtue ethics and kind of our theories of ethics or value theory? Excuse me, not virtue ethics, though it could be. Also talking about religious experience. Religious experience is an important element of religions, and so it's something that's studied by philosophy. What is religious experience? Is it an importantly different kind of epistemic state or state of mind that certain people enter into? Can it be used as a justification for particular arguments for and against the existence of God? And just as we had philosophy of particular sciences and arts, we have philosophy of particular religions, and that's kind of how these individual religions can interact with philosophy and can come to bear on that. So both philosophy of religion and philosophy of science use elements of metaphysics, epistemology, and even value theory to create their arguments. And the point of philosophy is to allow the arguments of religion and science to have a common language to talk to each other. We're going to talk briefly about a couple more categories that are kind of a bit of crossovers between epistemology and metaphysics, and then we are almost done. We have philosophy of language next. So philosophy of language talks about a lot of things. It deals with meaning. What does a certain word mean? It deals with semantics. Does it mean something different when a different person says it? Is 5 = 5 the same as 5 equals the square root of 25? Can I mean something if I'm talking about things that don't exist, like the King of France? And so on. We also study truth. Truth is one of those things like beauty that's a big idea in philosophy. That when someone goes into philosophy and has no idea what they're talking about, they say, I want to study truth. There are many, many different theories of truth, and we have a huge series on You Can't Handle the Truth, where we cover a lot of these different.
Dear students, if you understand this material, you must answer this question for self-control. If you don't understand anything of thing, you must sort this literature. This literature help you understand this thing. Thank you very much and goodbye.